let's use these 4 questions to look at the Song of Songs, our first text of the semester, and really our oldest and and really one of our most difficult. The text, the Song of Songs, we want to ask, what's the title? Who's the author? When was it written? What genre is it? And what's a one-piece summary? So some of you have read it already, or at least looked at it, and what is it? Well, it's a love story, or it's a love/courtship story. It seems to be an account of a man and a woman getting together. There's the bumper sticker version. A guy and a girl who are really in love with each other. So that's a bumper sticker version summary, a one sentence. If you had to describe what you're reading to somebody, you could use that. But every other one of those, it's what's their questions, becomes really tricky. So at one level, we're saying the title is the Song of Songs. That's a direct translation of the Hebrew title, Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs. Shir is song. So the Song of Songs. But in many of the Christian Bibles and many of the traditions, it's also called the Song of Solomon. So right away, in terms of the title, already we have a bit of a conundrum. We have a puzzle. We have a curious thing to work out. Why does a text have 2 titles? What's up with that? And which one should we use, or which one will we use? And this has a lot to do with the history of the text, and it's important. Some of you know, some of you have already noticed that the Song of Songs and the Song of Solomon are names of a chapter in the Christian Bible. It shows up in the part of the Christian Bible called the Old Testament. It's also part of the Jewish Bible. Many of you know that what the Christians called the Old Testament is largely the Jewish Bible that the Jews were pulling together, were using over many, many years before the time of Jesus of Nazareth. So we have this text that both Jews have read and Christians have read. And it turns out not just Jews and Christians, but everybody in the West who wrote and read in English also read this in English version. So there's two titles. So why did the older title, by the way, is Song of Songs? That's the one that the Jewish Bible uses. The Song of Solomon is a title that the Christians retitled the text, and the reason they did is because some of you know this already. When the Christians were pulling together the books of the Bible, they were all Jews. They knew the Jewish scriptures, but they wanted to add the stories, the teachings of Jesus on top of the Jewish Bible, which became known as the Old Testament. So one of the things that was really important to the new Christian communities was that Jesus of Nazareth was in fact the Messiah. Jesus was the leader that had been prophesied, that had been foretold in the Jewish writings, the writings of the Jewish community. So there's a lot of talk around Christmas time of Jesus of Nazareth within the lineage of David, and lots of lists of lots of names to say that King David, who's in the Jewish Bible, was an ancestor of Jesus of Nazareth. And Solomon is mixed up in all of that too. So King Solomon was really important. So the Christians said, okay, let's make believe that the guy in this text is King Solomon. That works well for the Christians' understanding of stuff. Now, King Solomon, as far as we know, was in fact a real historical king. Most of that evidence we have from the scriptures. King Solomon, the stories of King Solomon are in the early books of, I think they're in Kings, in the early writings of the Jewish Bible, the Christian Old Testament. And there's some things you should know about King Solomon. A, he was a good king. B, He was strong. He was a brilliant fighter. He was known for being impeccably ethical. King Solomon was just. And evidently, King Solomon was hot as hell. He was beautiful. He was beautiful, he was strong, successful in battle, and he was righteous. He was just, like the triple threat, everybody's idea of a perfect date. Anyways, that's the image of King Solomon that was passed down. Handsome, strong, beautiful, and according to what we can figure out of the timeline of the Jewish Bible, King Solomon lived around 1000 BCE. If in fact he lived in the year 1000 BCE. So we could say that the origin of this book, the date of these writings, if they were written by Solomon, if this is in fact Solomon's writing and Solomon's poetry, then it would date to the 1000 BC. But of course, who knows? We have no historical evidence to prove that. These texts were passed down orally for many, many years before anybody wrote them down, before we even had writing. They were collected over centuries. So we don't have any historical proof that there was a guy and that he had these poems and that it was about his life. But the tradition has imagined that. The Christian tradition, the Christian church's traditions have imagined that because it seems like a great story. Turns out that the text is very confusing. It seems to tell a story, but not really. And it's very repetitive. So one of the hypotheses about who wrote it or how it was written is that, in fact, it wasn't one guy. It wasn't a poet writing a love letter about his beloved, but rather that what we have here is a collection of a whole bunch of different love poems. We call a collection of poems a compilation. Just like you guys in the old days might make a playlist. You might compile your own playlist. Back in the old days, we made mixtapes. It was a great thing to take all the great songs you were for your hottie and put them together and send it to your hottie. And, oh, she loves me, he loves me. A compilation, it suddenly makes more sense that why it's so confusing, why it's so repetitive, that perhaps these 8 chapters weren't written in order. Perhaps instead they're a compilation, a collage, a stepping together, and that some people thought these were such great love songs that they wanted to hold them on, and they developed or devised a loosely constructed tale of 2 people as a way of knitting them together. As an excuse to collect these greatest hits of these wonderful love songs. So perhaps it wasn't authored by an author. Perhaps instead it was a compilation. So then the question becomes, when was this compilation written? When was it pulled together? Who did it? When were they alive? And it turns out, again, we have very scant evidence. It's very, we have a lot of work by biblical scholars and scholars, archaeologists and scholars of the antique languages. But it turns out that some of the language that is in the Song of Songs, in the original Hebrew versions, looks an awful lot like language from 650 BCE. So remember, in BCE, the time goes backwards. So 1000 comes first. Here's 0. Here's 2,000 years later. That's us. So the language of the Song of Songs looks like it dates to around 650 BCE, 350 years after Solomon could have lived. They know this because of some of the words. Like it would be like if someone wrote a poem today that they said, "Oh yeah, it was authored in 1950 by Allen Ginsberg, but the poem has cell phones in it." You know, well, Ginsberg didn't have cell phones in 1950. He couldn't be in the poem. So a poem that has cell phones in it has to at least be, references to Tinder and Grindr, has to be at least written, authored by somebody much, much later than the 50s. So it is with the Song of Songs. There's language that seems, imagery and language that seems closer to 650 than it does to 1000. And even more complicated, even more interestingly, this language looks very similar to language in a bunch of poems that were written in Arabic and were called wasifs. The images, the back and forth, some of the symbols that we see in the Jewish text also show up in Arab writing or poems, we should say, that have come down in Arab writing from the period of 650 BCE. How interesting. Maybe up in this odd Middle Age world, there were a bunch of Jewish communities speaking, or I should say Israelites, early Israelites, speaking versions of Hebrew, Aramaic, early antique versions of their small communities. And of course, they were meeting people who spoke Arabic at the market, at the port, and they were listening, and many of them could go back and forth between languages. And these wasifs were wonderful. They were great love songs. They were the pop songs of the day. They said, "This is great," and they went home and they told it to their wives and mothers and fathers and uncles. But they translated it back into their own language. So we have this traffic of languages, this back and forth between Arab languages of 650 and between the Israelites' language of 650. And perhaps that's where they come from. They are collected by many, and in fact, from their earliest collections, they were already translations of translations. So, okay, we have a date of 1000 that's probably erroneous. It's probably wrong. We have the date of 650, which is probably historically more accurate. But then the text that we're reading, in English, it doesn't come into English until the year 1611, when Queen Elizabeth's successor, King James, commissioned a whole bunch of Jewish and Greek scholars to translate the Old and New Testaments into English. We get the King James Version of the Bible. And that was the only version of the Bible that we had for hundreds and hundreds of years. The King James Version was the Bible that all of Christendom read. Actually, all of Roman Christendom read. So we have the first English in 1611, but that what we're reading is a translation that happened right down the street from you guys in 1952. A group of religious biblical scholars gathered in New Haven, Connecticut, in a room on Prospect Street, and they looked at the Greek, and they looked at the Hebrew, and they looked at wasifs, and they looked at the King James, and they did their best to write a contemporary English translation of the Old Testament and of the Song of Songs. So the version that you're reading, the English that says, "Oh, my beloved," that version actually is a translation that dates to 1952. It was highly based on an English version from 1611. It was historically probably based on time and culture and images from 650 BCE. That's a lot of years before. And then it was attributed to King Solomon amidst all of that to make it sound older and cooler and grander. So here we have the very first question. What's there? The author, the title, the date, and the genre. And already with this, an old text, the very simplest question is already one of the most difficult. So what are we going to say? Well, we're going to call it the Song of Songs. We're going to understand it as a compilation, not by a single authorship, although it's really interesting to think and talk about the tradition that felt like it needed to blame these lovely words on their great king from antiquity. Probably wasn't written in 1000. It was probably circulating as a bunch of wasifs, popular love songs in this region of what is now the Middle East. Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, parts of Turkey, down parts of North Africa, where all of this tumultuous cultural exchange was happening. And that we translated in 1611 and 1952. This genre term we will use for this is called biblical poetry. Okay, that was 15-minute lecture and only one question. I'm going to have to speed it up as we get into the other 4 in the next videos. What's there? The Song of Songs.